Hello. Now, in this video, I would like to tell you the stories of 10 men who received horrendous wounds in battle, but didn't die. Many of them carried on serving in the armed forces or the uniformed services in some fashion, and most of them lived long and happy lives, despite, as I say, having horrendous wounds in some of the worst wars in human history. I've tried to be brief with each of the 10 stories, but it's quite difficult, especially when a lot of them have a very long military career. It's very difficult just to squeeze it down into a few paragraphs. So let's get on with it. So, first up, Sam Brown. Born in 1824, Sam Brown joined the British Army, and by 1849 he was a lieutenant and tasked with raising his own cavalry regiment. Officers would often do this in parts of the British Empire. I talked a lot about Rorke's Drift in my last video. The Natal native contingent that Shees served in was one of those. It was a regiment formed of locally sourced troops. Sam Brown's cavalry units fought in many battles across India, and after he died they actually took his name. I don't know why he didn't call them after himself while he was alive, but anyway, there you go. On the 31st of August 1858, Brown undertook an action that would earn him the Victoria Cross. He was leading a charge at Siapora when he spotted an artillery gun about to fire and mow down his infantry. And presumably it must have fired. Anyway, he set off on his horse, on his own, so I gather, and charging in with his sword, he started hacking up all the gunners on the gun. And he prevented them reloading. Well, he sort of paused them reloading a bit. As he did so, bear in mind there's probably, 4 men to a gun at least. As he did so, he received a sword slash across the left knee, because remember he's up on a horse, so his knee is about there, sort of head height. Sword slash across the knee, and then he received another quite deep cut across his left arm. That led to his left arm being amputated. I don't know what the story is, but I suppose some will say that the arm was cut clean off in one go, but either way he lost an arm. He was very quickly promoted from captain to colonel, and I think the idea of that was to push him further up the ranks. Generally by the time you get to full colonel in the army, it's probably a bit different in the Victorian period, but by the time you get to the rank of colonel, you are essentially sort of a desk job, more or less. He found it very difficult. Officers, as I say, still carried swords in those days. He found it very difficult to draw his sword, because normally what you do is you take hold of it with your left hand and you pull it with your right hand. Well, he didn't have a left hand, so he couldn't pull the sword. The scabbard would just come up and the belt would twist, and he'd just make a mess of himself. And making a mess of yourself when you're an officer is not the done thing. You have to look the part, even if you're crap, which he wasn't. So he came up with an idea. He didn't design it, obviously, but he attached a belt across his chest, and this became known as the Sam Brown belt. I always misheard it when I was younger and thought it was Sand Brown. But no, it's Sam Brown, the person. If you look him up online, actually, his Wikipedia page is shorter than the article about the belt itself. That's awkward. But anyway, yes, it became quite useful. The belts, as time went on, officers had to wear more kit. You could no longer just go into battle with a sword and a pistol and maybe your monocle or something, I don't know. So they started attaching ammunition and all sorts of things. It became sort of early webbing. You will notice it's still worn today in various types of dress uniform, certainly in Western armies, and also police forces use it a lot. General Sir Sam Brown died in 1901, aged 76, which is not bad considering he had an arm cut off in battle. So our next Unkillable Warrior really took some editing to get it down to anything that would be less than half an hour, because this guy fought for decades. Born in 1889 in England, Bernard Brayburg moved to New Zealand at the age of 2. He grew up to be a very strong swimmer. I think there's a leisure centre, swimming complex type place named after him in New Zealand at the moment. This would come in very useful later, as you shall see. Supposedly in 1914 he fought under Pancho Villa in the Mexican Revolution, but how much of that is true we don't know. When World War I began, he moved to the UK and initially joined the Royal Naval Division. In 1915 he volunteered to swim ashore onto a Turkish beach during the Gallipoli campaign, the idea being to light distraction flares on this Turkish beach. The point being that it would distract the Turks from where the actual landings were taking place. For that he was awarded his first Distinguished Service Order. There would be more. He was wounded, I think, he was wounded... I don't actually know. He was wounded a few times during that campaign. But again, wasn't killed. In May 1916, he transferred to the British Army as a captain and fought in the Battle of the Somme. During one action, he was acting as a lieutenant colonel and led an assault on a German-held village. For 2 days, the British attacked and then counterattacked, and 2 days it went on. He was wounded 4 times, and his unit took 500 German prisoners. For that, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. In 1917, he was made temporary brigadier. As you shall see with another of our Unkillable Warriors later, a lot of officers, junior officers, suddenly rocketed up the ranks because they'd survived. You need the command structure, you need somebody at the top, and if all your top guys keep getting killed, and you get promoted very quickly. So in 1917, although still only really a captain, Bernard Freyberg was made a brigadier, and somehow survived an artillery shell exploding at his feet. I don't know. He continued to fight in World War I, and in the spring offensives of 1918 he was awarded his second Distinguished Service Order. Right at the end of the war, I think it might have been even the day of the armistice, I'm not sure, he led a cavalry charge to capture a bridge somewhere, I can't remember where, and that gained him his third Distinguished Service Order. Despite having 9 different wounds from the Great War, he attempted to swim the English Channel in the 1920s. Not just once, but several times. Yeah. Anyway, by 1937 he was found to have a heart problem and had to be retired from the British Army. He retired with the rank of Major General at the age of just 45. Yeah, that's an achievement. But he wasn't done. Oh no. When World War II began, he rejoined the army, but this time the New Zealand Army, and commanded Allied forces during the Battle of Crete. He fought in North Africa and Italy, and in 1944 he survived a plane crash. Still not being killed by any of this. By the end of the Second World War, he gained his 4th Distinguished Service Order. So with British honours, that would be represented by the DSO and 3 bars. Men who served with him said there was hardly a part of his body without scars. And Churchill himself nicknamed him the Salamander because he was able to walk through fire without being killed. He later went on, after the war, he became Governor-General of New Zealand, and his awards included the Victoria Cross, 4 DSOs, the GCMG, that's the Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St Michael and St George. I think he was the French Croix de Guerre and a member of the US Legion of Merit. Just all the awards, all of them. Bernard Freyberg died in England in 1963, aged 74, when one of his war wounds finally ruptured. Even the Salamander could only cheat death for so long. So our next Unkillable Warrior is one of my all-time favourite stories of heroism. Lakiman Gurung was a Gurkha. I am going to do a video on who the Gurkhas were, because I think a lot of people outside the UK, well certainly outside the UK Armed Forces, don't know. Born in 1917, Gurung was too short to be a Gurkha, which is saying something, because they're really little people anyway. There's a famous picture of a Gurkha next to a guardsman. The guardsmen are usually 6 foot plus, and then his bare skin on top, and Gurkhas are tiny little people. But they are terrifying. I don't know what the height limit is, but Gurung was 4'10" and considered too short. So I'm guessing the height limit was about 5 foot. 5 feet. Anyway, when World War II began, they needed all the men they could get, and so he was accepted and served with distinction. At the age of 27, he was a rifleman fighting the Japanese in Burma. The story goes that his trench was the closest to the Japanese lines, and they launched, about 200 Japanese soldiers launched a huge attack, just wave upon wave of troops charging their position, and on 2 occasions grenades fell into his trench. I'm going to use this. Grenade comes in, he picked it up, ooh, threw it back. Another one came in, ooh, throw that back. A third one, and it was third time unlucky, third one came in, he picked it up, he threw it, and just as it left his hand it exploded. The blast took off his fingers, shattered his right arm, blinded him in one eye, embedded shrapnel in his face, his body, his chest, and his leg. It also incapacitated all the men around him. Despite this, he continued to fire his Lee Enfield rifle with one hand and one eye. I don't even know how you do that. How would you fire a Lee Enfield with your left hand? You'd sort of over the top, but I don't know. But he did. After the battle, once they squashed the charge, beaten the Japanese back, 87 of the estimated 200 soldiers were killed, and I think it was 31 of them were outside his trench. How do you kill 31 people with a single shot rifle, with one hand and one eye? There you go. For that horrendous level of bravery, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Understandably so. He continued to serve in the Gurkhas, presumably not in a frontline role, but he left the Gurkhas in 1947 with the rank of Honorary Sergeant. He would go on to marry twice, he fathered 5 children, and ran a small farm in Nepal. Again, how do you do that with one arm? He died in 2010, just before his 93rd birthday. Wow. Okay, so far, I've just realised that all of our Unkillable Warriors have been in the British Armed Forces. So how about an American? Thomas Norris. No relation that I know of. Born in 1944 in Florida, Thomas Norris joined the Navy in 1967 and eventually became a SEAL. As part of SEAL Team 2, he earned the Bronze Star in Vietnam for his first tour. In early 1972, Norris was tasked with a rescue operation, and it was a downed air crew, and he led this mission something like 2 kilometres behind enemy lines and rescued at least 2 of the air crew. About 3 years later, he was awarded the Medal of Honour for that mission, but I think before that it was largely forgotten, his rescue mission. It was only when something else happened that it was remembered that he'd done this great act of bravery and leadership. I should have pointed out he was a lieutenant, or lieutenant in the US military. So back to 1972, 6 months after the rescue operation, he was on an intelligence gathering mission in the demilitarized zone of Vietnam, and approaching from the sea, like SEALs like to, he was in a small dinghy with 1 other SEAL and 3 South Vietnamese Special Forces. The other Navy SEAL was his NCO, a man called Mike Thornton. Now, long story short, They got lost. They landed in North Vietnam. Their small 5-man team was spotted. They were attacked by a force estimated to be between 200 to 300 North Vietnamese troops. Now, they decided the best thing to do was run. So they fought a fighting retreat back to the sea. Norris was at the back of the retreat, if you like, in terms of he was doing a lot of the firing at the enemy to keep their heads down while the rest of the force ran back to the sea. Now, at some point in the retreat, he was shot in the head. Yeah. The South Vietnamese troops that were with them thought he was dead, so they left him. But Thornton refused to leave a man behind, especially his officer that he liked and respected. So Thornton ran back towards the attacking enemy, picked up his officer, and ran back towards the sea. En route, he obviously had to shoot as many of the enemy as he could, and one of the South Vietnamese special forces was wounded in the retreat. So Thornton picked him up as well, and continued his run to the sea. And then when he got there, he spent about 3 hours swimming around, keeping these men afloat until the boat that had dropped them off came to pick them up. Norris survived. How, I don't know, but he did. His first surgery was 19 hours long. He lost, I think it's his left eye and part of his skull in the process. Thornton was awarded the Medal of Honour for rescuing him, and Norris had to leave the SEALs. He took years to recover, but 7 years later, in 1979, he joined the FBI, and not in a desk job. He served for 20 years in the FBI, and one of his jobs was a team leader of their hostage rescue and assault team, after being shot in the head. I'm glad to say both men are still alive, and they're still friends to this day. Now then, our next Unkillable Warrior, I'm not going to say his name. I want to see how many of you can work it out before I get there. So, our next Unkillable Warrior was born in 1887 in England. He joined the army. He was almost kicked out of Sandhurst several times for essentially bullying. He didn't suffer fools gladly, so he would pick on people that he considered more stupid than he. And being very arrogant, that was most people. He did eventually commission. He commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1908. 1914, he was sent to France to fight in the First World War. On the 13th of October 1914, he was shot in the chest. Well, he was actually shot in the back, but the bullet lodged in the chest. According to his memoirs, the manual for defences said that you were supposed to build the defence and then go and view it from the enemy's point of view, which he did. But of course the enemy can already see it, and they can see you as an officer standing in front of it. So they shot him. It was a sniper, they reckon. It was very early days of the war. And it was about 3 p.m. he was shot. And his men... He was loved by his men, and they desperately tried to retrieve him, realising he was still alive, although horrifically wounded. And one of the men that got to him and was killed and fell over. He fell on top of his officer, and it was actually his body lying on him that protected him from a lot more of the bullets coming from the sniper. The sniper could see that he was still alive and kept trying to find a spot he could put more bullets into. Eventually he did receive another shot in the knee, but the body largely saved him, and it wasn't until nightfall, so a good at least 3 hours later, that he was recovered, still alive, but he'd spent over 3 hours lying in no man's land, cold, wet, tired, hole in the chest and the back, struggling to breathe, blood loss. He was taken back to a sort of field hospital, and as the whole unit was moving shortly, it was a case of, is he going to survive or not? I don't think he is. So they dug a grave for him. but he didn't die. He put his survival down to being very fit and became fanatical about fitness in training later on. And years later, when he became a more senior officer, he insisted on training constantly, and this would annoy many of his peers, his fellow generals and colonels and things. And have you guessed who it is yet? He lost a lung to the bullets and insisted that nobody smoke anywhere near him. He used to smoke quite a lot himself, but he had to give it up. Famously, he would only let 2 people smoke near him. I believe one was the King and one was Winston Churchill. If you haven't guessed, this man, who as a junior officer was very nearly snuffed out as one of the millions of unnecessary casualties in the First World War, was Bernard Montgomery, or Monty as he became to be known. By the time he retired from the army in 1958, he had a list of awards and medals as long as your arm. He'd achieved the highest rank in the British Army, that of Field Marshal. When he retired, I believe he held the title of Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Obviously, he'd planned a lot of D-Day, a lot of it was his plan. Not wholly successful, but very popular with his men. By the time he'd retired, he'd been in the army for 50 years, and eventually he died in 1976, aged 88. So, back to the American military again. Our next unkillable warrior is Desmond Doss. Born in 1919 in Virginia, Desmond Doss joined the army in 1942, but famously he refused to carry a rifle. He was, I think it's called a Seventh-day Adventist, and therefore couldn't carry arms and would be considered a conscientious objector, but could still serve a purpose, so he served as a medic. You may have seen the recent film about him called Hacksaw Ridge. It's a pretty good film, although it's interesting that when films are made, they tend to exaggerate events as they happen to make them more dramatic. There's at least one event that was cut out of the film, or rather kept out of the film, because the director didn't believe that audiences would believe it. And his heroics took place over a much longer time than the film portrays. The film, I think, portrays it sort of over a couple of days. It was actually more like 20 days. So, by the time of the events of the film, he'd done quite a bit of fighting anyway. People didn't doubt his heroism anymore. But anyway, that's beside the point. So, while fighting in Guam and the Philippines, he was awarded 2 Bronze Stars for helping wounded soldiers under fire. His most famous exploit took place during the Battle of Okinawa. He continually ran through artillery, grenade, rifle fire to patch up and carry wounded soldiers. He also famously lowered an average estimate of 75 men down a 400-foot cliff just using his hands and a rope. And this obviously caused severe rope burns. At one point during the battle, he himself was wounded badly in the legs by a grenade. Now, obviously, he was a medic, so he said he kept the stretcher bearers elsewhere. He said, treat them, I can treat myself as long as my hands work. So they did, and apparently he waited 5 hours before being rescued. Now, I believe the story goes that while they were carrying him to safety on the stretcher, they were set upon by Japanese tanks. And then he saw another wounded man and said, no, put me down, save him. So they did, and while he was waiting for him to come back, a sniper's bullet shattered his arm. I can't remember which arm it is now. There is a picture. I will put a picture somewhere of him after the battle. He somehow managed to then strap a rifle butt stock to his arm to act as a splint, and then decided to crawl 300 yards with a shattered arm to get to the aid post. He got fed up of waiting for the stretchers to actually pick him up. Over the course of 20 continuous days of combat, Doss had saved anywhere up to 100 lives He'd been wounded seriously 4 times and was finally evacuated on the 21st of May 1945. When operated on, he had 17 bits of shrapnel removed from his body, and for his heroism he was eventually ordered the Medal of Honor. So that was pretty good. Unfortunately, his civilian life didn't get much better. In 1946 he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and after being treated for it for over 5 years, he ended up losing a lung and 5 ribs. In 1976 he accidentally overdosed on antibiotics and went completely deaf. Despite all these problems, he still managed to raise a small family on a farm in Georgia. Desmond Doss eventually died in 2006, aged 87. So, this Unkillable Warrior is mentioned in several documentaries. One notable one was made by the motoring journalist and somewhat amateur historian Jeremy Clarkson. He made a documentary a few years ago about his former father-in-law, who was awarded the Victoria Cross at Arnhem. Anyway, despite that fact, his favourite Victoria Cross is a Victoria Cross story, and recipient is the one I'm about to tell you. Born in 1896 in England, Ferdinand West, sometimes called Freddie West, but do not look up Fred West. That's why he's no longer called Fred in this anymore in these stories. Ferdinand West joined the British Army in World War I and later joined the Royal Flying Corps. After several hazardous flights, he was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery and skill in combat. In April 1918, he witnessed the downfall of the Red Baron, famously, and in other battles he survived being outnumbered 4-1 in the air, so he was pretty good. In August of 1918, West held the rank of captain, serving in number 8 squadron of the now renamed Royal Air Force. He was attacked, his lone plane was attacked by 7 German aircraft, and their initial burst of fire shattered his radio, so it didn't work, and 3 explosive bullets ripped through one of his legs and cut it off completely while he's flying. As it did so, his leg fell off into the pedal controls of his aircraft, which was a bit inconvenient, I can imagine. The story goes that he lifted his leg out of the controls and presumably put it to one side, twisted his underwear into a tourniquet to stem the flow of blood. He then managed to manoeuvre his aircraft sufficiently that his gunner/observer was able to get off several good bursts into the enemy and drive all 7 of them away. He then obviously had to land pretty quickly because he's still bleeding to death, and he's still in command of the plane. The story goes that he landed in a field near some Canadian troops. Once he was got out of the aircraft, he apologised for the poor quality of his landing, fainted, woke up, gave his report, and then sought medical attention for his leg. What's even worse, or better rather, is he never mentioned it. He never mentioned the loss of a leg to his observer until after they landed. He didn't think to mention it. Although, to be honest, it would probably panic you. Imagine being on a British Airways flight or something, or other airlines are available. Imagine being on an airline and suddenly, it's your captain speaking, don't want to alarm any of you, but I've just had my leg blown off. That would worry you, wouldn't it? Maybe that's why I didn't tell him. For his coolness under fire, and surviving, having his leg blown off, and all while in horrendous pain, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Afterwards he was fitted with a prosthetic leg and continued to fly in the Air Force. Early in World War II he worked in Italy and helped captured airmen, downed airmen escape. This meant that he was wanted by the Gestapo, and despite a price on his head and the Gestapo searching for him, they never got him. He retired after the war with the rank of Air Commodore and died in 1988, aged 92. That's not bad. So, I think we're now into the final 3, and they really start getting hard to kill at this point. So our next soldier, warrior, is a man called Johnson Bihari, quite famous recently. He was born in Grenada in 1979 and joined the British Army in 2001. He served in all the theatres the British Army was posted to in that time. But he's most famous because in 2004 he was in Iraq as a warrior driver. It's appropriate, isn't it? And on 2 occasions saved many lives by his quick thinking under fire. On the 1st of May 2004, he was in the lead vehicle of a convoy of warriors when they were ambushed by small arms and RPG and anything the Taliban could throw at them. Now the warrior is... it looks like a small tank, but it's not armoured anywhere near as much as the tank. It's an infantry carrier with a gun, but anyway. So being at the front, he was taking the brunt of the fire. His commander and his gunner were wounded, and his radio was knackered. So he had to make a quick action. He decided to just drive forwards. Obviously he went backwards, he'd crash into the rest of the convoy, so he drove through the hail of everything coming at him. At one point his periscope was broken, so he had to manually see where he was going. That means opening his hatch, sticking his head out into the oncoming fire to see where he was going. So now he's driving along for the next mile with his head exposed to everything coming at it. At one point a bullet lodged in his helmet, which I imagine was a bit of a bit of a whiplash. But it stayed there. It just broke the I think the inner lining, but it didn't actually get to his head. Once he got to a safe location, he evacuated his commander. Witnesses say that he pulled his commander out of the tank with one hand. Have you ever tried picking up... just for example, try and do a one-armed pull-up. That's the kind of level, and then add a bit of body armour, and then the awkwardness of being in a vehicle. Anyway, that's what they say. He got the gunner out as well. The vehicle is still on fire at this point. He then drove it to a safe location and then extinguished the flames. And then he himself had to be taken away because he just collapsed. So that was his first action. He didn't stay in hospital very long. He checked out as soon as he could. By the 11th of June that year, he was back driving his A Warrior once again. And again, lead vehicle of the convoy. And again, they were ambushed at close range. This time, he'd been driving with his head out of the vehicle, already exposed. And an RPG exploded 6 inches from his head. I think it was that side, actually. 6 inches from his head. Massive head injuries. If you see him shortly afterwards, there's a huge scar down there. I think that was from the operation. Again, didn't die, but his gunner and his commander were wounded, but not as badly as the first time. Despite brain damage, agony, blood pouring down his face, big hole in the head, he had to do something. So this time he reversed out of the combat area, and they think he probably passed out at this point because they just kept going back until he hit a house and then they stopped, and there was no word coming from him at all. He and his crew were evacuated by another crew. So he survived that, just. He was asked about it later. For those 2 actions, I should point out, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. And I think it was the first one since the Falklands, which, if my maths is correct, was 22 years earlier. Victoria Crosses were getting pretty rare by this point. It was the first award in a long time. And anyway, he was asked about it later, and he wasn't really thinking about what he said. Somebody said, "What was going through your head at this tough time?" And he said, "An RPG." So, yeah, he's still around. The injuries he received still cause him pain to this day. And on top of that, obviously, traumatic events like that, they don't leave scars that are visible on the outside. Suffering with PTSD, nightmares, pain, all sorts of things. Bihari actually attempted suicide, at least once that we know of, by crashing his car at 100 miles an hour. As I say, Unkillable Warriors, life wasn't done with him yet. He survived unscathed, got out, walked away almost, and now works with other soldiers suffering the same sort of problems. He is still technically in the army, although he's not allowed to serve on the front line because he does have brain damage. And I think it's just incredible. So, our penultimate unkillable warrior is a man called Roy Benavidez. Some of you will know this story already. Roy was born in Texas in 1935 and joined the army in 1955, having already served in the National Guard. By 1965, he was a Special Forces advisor in Vietnam. During a patrol on his first tour, he received an explosion to the legs. Nobody knows whether it was a grenade or a mine that he stepped on, but he was taken back to the US and was told he'd never walk again. He spent a long time in the hospital. When the hospital was quiet at night, he managed to get himself out of the bed and he'd walk on apparently using his chin and his elbows because his legs didn't work. He'd crawl across the floor and then he would slowly and painfully, and apparently often leading these events left him in tears, he'd force himself to stand up, first to a kneeling position and then standing. Just over a year later, having been told he'd never walk again, he walked out of the hospital, and not only that, he returned to active service in Vietnam. But that's not what he's most famous for. He returned to Vietnam in January 1968. In May 1968, reports started coming in of a patrol that had been ambushed, a 12-man patrol, been ambushed by anywhere up to 1,000 North Vietnamese troops, taking casualties, and Roy took the initiative. He jumped on board the nearest helicopter that was heading in that direction, and he was armed with only a knife and a medical bag, going into a war zone. Yeah. So, the story goes that he jumped out of the helicopter when it was low enough to do so, and ran around administering medical assistance to the wounded, gathering up the dead soldiers, not wanting to leave them behind. Meanwhile, being fired at by everything the North Vietnamese could throw at him. At one point, he was stabbed with a bayonet, and he just pulled the bayonet out, got his own knife, and killed the man that stabbed him, and carried on. So he managed to get all the wounded he could into a helicopter, and having done that, it then crashed. So he had to do it all again. Eventually, he got 8 living men into a helicopter, along with the presumably as many dead as he could manage, as well as various important documents so that the North Vietnamese didn't get hold of them. He's still being shot at by everything, and apparently he had to be pulled into the evacuation helicopter because he just collapsed. So they pulled him into the helicopter, carried him away. The story goes, once they were back at the camp, he was so caked in blood that they just thought he was dead. They just thought he was mush. Twice, doctors looked at him and said, no, he's not. No, he's gone. And supposedly the story goes that they were zipping up his body bag, and he was awake enough that he thought, I'm not dead. There's a Monty Python joke in there for you. Some say he spat blood into the doctor's face, some say he just spat blood anyway. Either way, he spat, presumably it was mostly blood that came out, to let them know he was still alive. So once they realised he was alive, they then worked on trying to save him. It was described as 6 hours of hell. And afterwards he was found to have 7 gunshot wounds, 28 shrapnel wounds, both arms, because he wasn't armed, he had arms, but he didn't have a rifle. He went in with a knife and a medical bag. So every time he was attacked by a bayonet, he had to stop it with his arms and his hands. His arms were shredded by bayonet lashings and all sorts of things. He had shrapnel in his head, his shoulders, I was going to say his knees and his toes, but he had his buttocks, feet and legs, apparently. Don't turn that into a nursery rhyme. He had a head wound where he'd been hit on the back of the head with a rifle butt. One bullet had entered his back and come out just under his heart. Just missed it. I think that would have killed him if it had hit. And also, probably by that bullet, one of his lungs had been destroyed. But he was still alive. Just. Initially, he was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. For a few reasons. One, it wasn't thought that he would survive. And the DSC can be awarded much quicker than the Medal of Honor. And also, it later transpired, you need a living witness. And I gather a lot of the men that he saved died later. They didn't think there were any living witnesses to what he'd done. So the attack was in May. He was awarded his Distinguished Service Cross in September of 1968, while still in hospital. But despite his horrendous injuries, he still didn't die. Years later, they managed to find a living witness, who by this point was living the other side of the world. And he was finally awarded his Medal of Honor in 1981 by Ronald Reagan. Reagan famously, because Reagan had been an actor, he famously said that if the story was written into a movie script, you wouldn't believe it. I'm not sure I do. But there you go. Roy P. Benavidez finally retired from the army in 1976 with the rank of Master Sergeant and died in 1998 at the age of 63. So, now we come to our 10th Unkillable Warrior, and this man actually had the nickname the Unkillable Soldier. He's possibly one of my favourite people in history. Let's just get into it. He was born in Belgium in 1880 and had the name of Adrian Carleton de Wiart. He actually had a lot more names than that, but I'll put them on the screen here. He's sometimes referred to in articles as the most interesting man on Wikipedia, or on the internet. But his page doesn't tell the full story. I scoured his autobiography, which he entitled A Happy Odyssey. A wounded odyssey, I would say. His page doesn't include all of the injuries he received when he wasn't on the battlefield. This guy was horrendously accident-prone. I've compiled the full injury list from his autobiography, and it's quite the read. So, he initially, although being born an aristocrat, he sought out action and war and adventure. So, although being born in Belgium, he joined the British Army as a private, under a false name. Well, he called himself Trooper Carleton. He fought in the Second Boer War, and he was shot in the stomach. You can't see stomach, you know where the stomach is, and the groin, which I think even at the time he said it spoiled his prospects somewhat. In India, later on, he fell from his horse twice while hunting, broke ribs, injured his shoulder and his ankle. In 1904, he was in Egypt and fell off his horse during a race and gave himself concussion. In 1906, he was operated on for a previous war wound, although it doesn't say which one, and later broke his leg playing polo. But he didn't know it was broken because he didn't get it looked at until the tournament was over. So, in 1914, he wasn't sent to the trenches. No. The British Empire was fighting all over the place. He was sent to Somaliland. During a battle there, he received a splinter to the elbow, but I don't think it would have been a little sort of pine needle size. If he mentioned it in his autobiography, it was going to be a huge chunk of wood. So he got a splinter in the elbow, his ear was split by a bullet, and twice he was hit in the left eye. One of them, he says it was a glancing blow. I think it was shrapnel from, or possibly brickwork or something happened near his left eye. The second time was an actual ricocheted bullet. So it bounced off something else and then hit him in the eye. I think that's one of the few times he actually talks of actually being in pain. Despite all his injuries, he never mentions pain once. I think he only says the word about 5 times in the book. He ended up having his left eye removed, but the operation was done back in England in January 1915. When they took his eye out, they found a small bit of metal behind the eyeball. So it had gone right the way through. Despite this, he insisted on serving in France. By this point, the First World War was raging. He insisted on going to France. The story goes that they said, well, we can't be sending one-eyed officers to the front. We can't be that desperate. So they insisted on him wearing a glass eye. And the story goes that he put the glass eye in, passed the medical board, got outside into a taxi, pulled his glass eye out, threw it out the window, put an eye patch on, and never wore a glass eye ever again. He's already had quite a few injuries, and now he's in the First World War. That's before he's got to the First World War. He's lost an eye before he's got to the First World War. So, during the Second Battle of Ypres, he was actually thrown several yards by an explosion that killed his second-in-command, who was standing next to him. His second-in-command actually said to him just before that, "I wish you'd duck when those shells came over." And, ducking obviously wasn't the thing to do. Later he was shot in the wristwatch. He wore a watch on his left wrist. A bullet hit his watch square on, pushed the watch back into the wrist. The force of it ripped off 3 fingers. It left 2 fingers dangling. He doesn't say which 2 though. Doctors refused to amputate his fingers. He just had a mess of a hand. Just, two fingers dangling. So he pulled them off himself. Apparently felt no pain doing it. Later on, he received the Victoria Cross. He was acting as a much more senior rank. He received the Victoria Cross for attacking a town called La Boiselle, or something along those lines. But he didn't mention it in his memoirs. The only thing he said in his memoirs was that after the War Office sent him official copies of how they were going to write the history. And they said, can you find any fault with this? Does it match what you think happened? And he replied with, well, I thought it was my regiment. He listed them by name. He didn't say my regiment. He thought it was his men that captured La Boiselle, but it wasn't mentioned officially in the records. I'm digressing here. Very interesting life. He always, whenever he was asked about his VC later, he attributed it to his men. He never took the credit for it. During the Battle of the Somme, he was shot in the back of the head. And it's actually quite funny, although it probably shouldn't be. The story he tells is being shot, and he's in a shell crater. As he feels like he's trying to put his brain back in his head. What had happened? The bullet had gone through the skull at the back, but effectively like a flesh wound, but through bone. It hadn't hit the brain. So he's back into hospital for that. His unit lost 8 brand new officers killed in one night. You remember I said about Bernard Freyberg was promoted very quickly. Well, this happened to Carleton de Wiart as well. He rose in 1 year. He rose from captain to brigadier, just for the fact he was able to survive. Carried on serving. He's been shot in the arm, the neck, everything. The day before the Battle of Arras, a shell splinter split his ear open. And at Passchendaele, another shell splinter lodged into his hip. At the Battle of Cambrai, an explosion nearly took his leg off. So he finished the First World War with multiple shrapnel wounds and bullet wounds, and lost an arm. But despite all that, he famously said, "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war. It had given me many bad moments, lots of good ones, and plenty of excitement." Between the wars, he worked and lived in Poland, and he's part of the British military mission there, but his fun didn't stop. He fell off of a moving train. He narrowly missed being hit by a bullet fired from a soldier on the ground while he was in an aircraft. The bullet came out 6 inches from his seat. He survived 2 forced landings from a plane due to mechanical failure. And due to rebels, bandits and Cossacks, he slept with a gun under his pillow. So for 20 years, he lived and worked in Poland. He did resign from the military, the British Army, during that time. But when the Germans and the Russians closed in to grab Poland, he managed to get out of there. He actually managed to get out via Romania with help from the government. But the day he left was exactly the same day that the Romanian Prime Minister was killed. So it's just in the nick of time. Anyway, he rejoined the British Army and was immediately sent to take control of a unit in Norway. The idea was to fight some sort of holding action against the Germans in Norway. Not a good start. On the way over, his plane was attacked by a fighter and he crash-landed into water. Survived. Fine. When it was realised that they weren't going to hold Norway, they were all put onto ships. The Navy came in and took them away. The ship he was supposed to be sailing on was hit by a German aircraft and sank. He'd supposed to have been travelling on it. I think he sailed away. I think it was on the Duke of York. I'm not sure. But the smaller ship he was supposed to be on sank, and he actually expresses almost regret at not experiencing a sinking ship, because he's pretty much been sunk or shot down or anything on every other form of transport so far. Later on, he was flying across the Mediterranean when both engines on his Wellington bomber failed, and he had to endure another crash into water. And he was captured by the Italians, and he was held in a castle that I can't pronounce the name of, but I will put the name of it here somewhere. Sometimes it was called the Italian or Mussolini's Colditz. Commonly, I think it was known as Campo 12. And he spent 2.5 years in this camp. And due to his injuries and his age, he was put in with a load of other generals, and it was a bit cushy. It certainly wasn't a concentration camp. These generals, I think the youngest of these officers, they weren't all generals, but a lot of them were senior officers, and the youngest of them I think was 48. Anyway, because of his injuries, and the Italians, by the mid sort of 42, 43, they were starting to think, oh, we might not actually win this, we want to be on the winning side. They started making overtures, and it was a case of, well, we might swap, we'll give him back as long as he doesn't come back as a combatant. He can't carry on serving on the front. So they sent questions, asking permission. And the papers came through saying, yep, we can repatriate him, we won't send him back to the front, we'll take him back quite happily. Except that when he came to be released, he wasn't there. These senior officers had spent the last 7 months tunnelling. They had tried the cliched going over the wall with the sheets tied together, but it didn't work. They were always picked up. A brilliant story, I gather, at one point. They decided, the Italians asked for reinforcements to keep hold of these geriatric generals that kept giving them the slip. So they were sent a machine gun, but they didn't know how to put it together. So they asked their much more experienced captives to put it together for them. And these generals and brigadiers were quite happy to put together the machine gun that was going to guard them, and then leave out all the working parts so that if it ever fired it wouldn't work. I give you the Italian army. So yeah, they tunnelled out of solid rock. This castle was on a mountain. They escaped. Was it 4 or 6 of them got out? 2 of them got clean away. Adrian Carleton escaped. Bearing in mind he was 63 years old, he had 1 arm and 1 eye. He trekked 150 miles in 8 days dressed as an Italian peasant and didn't speak any Italian. He did all this carrying £25 rucksack on his back, and in all that time the only thing he complained of was a blistered toe. After he was back in England, they finally did repatriate him. They captured him and repatriated him. Churchill sent him to China as his personal representative, and he got on fabulously with Chiang Kai-shek, the Generalissimo, as he calls him. But his accidents didn't stop there. He was in China and he survived another plane crash, this time onto land. And so I think we're up to, was it 2 forced landings and at least 3 plane crashes, 2 of them into water. After the war ended, he was offered to stay on as advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. His tenure as Prime Minister's representative came to an end. He was due to retire, so he sort of thought about it. But he'd gone so well with the Generalissimo that he asked him to stay on as his personal advisor. And he said, well, I'm just going to go back to England for a bit and see how I feel. Obviously, a few years later, the Chinese Revolution, he might have got caught up in all that, and that probably wouldn't have ended well. Anyway, in 1946, he was meandering his way back to England when, at the age of 66, he fell down some stairs. All the way down some stairs. And smacked his head at the bottom, knocked himself out, and crushed a vertebra in his back. Age 66. I think in the book he said he was strapped up. He was covered, plaster of Paris from the neck down, kind of thing, to hold him in one piece. And he said every time he bent over for months afterwards, it felt like he was going to break in half. When back in England, he spent 7 months being operated on in hospital. And the quote from the book, he says, "They tidied me up inside and out, excavated all sorts of old bits of scrap iron, and sent me away a fitter, if no wiser man." He did learn to walk again, but it was because he was injured that he wrote his memoirs. Probably because he had nothing to do while recovering in hospital. He was half Belgian, half Irish. I think his mother was Irish. And he doesn't say it in his book, but he retired to Ireland with his second wife. He never actually mentions getting married, but he was married twice. Like he never mentions the Victoria Cross. The unkillable soldier finally died of natural causes in 1963, aged 83. That was my list of 10 unkillable warriors. If you can think of any more that are deserving, I know of loads, but if you know of any, I would love to hear them. I do really like researching this stuff. I think it's amazing. So please do like and subscribe. There will be a lot more of this thing coming in the future. I'm already working on my next video, which is all about animals in warfare, and animals being awarded for bravery, no less. It's probably be called something like Tales of Battle. And yeah, thanks for watching.